Welcome to the Rewarding Retirement Podcast, where Aaron Kirsch, a certified financial planner, and Laura Zettel Watson, a professor of psychology, discuss research-based concepts and strategies for you to live your best life based on their book, The Rewarding Retirement Workbook.
Thanks for joining us today. I'm Laura Zettel Watson.
And I'm Aaron Kirsch. In our last podcast, we talked about stepping off the treadmill and finding lasting happiness in retirement. And this podcast today is a follow-up on that podcast where we're still going to talk about happiness, but we're going to address the happiness equation.
This happiness equation, what is that all about?
Well, we want to talk a little bit about why happiness matters, where it comes from, talk a little bit about the science behind happiness and how you can intentionally create more of happiness. So let's talk a little bit about why happiness matters. There's a lot of research into happiness and how it affects you, both emotionally and physically.
Yeah, and I've alluded to this a lot in our prior podcasts and certainly in our book. There is so much research out there on happiness. This is something that we are striving for at every age. Researchers have not quite figured out exactly how to define it, and everybody uses a slightly different definition. But regardless of what or how we define it or what definition we use, we're consistently finding that higher levels of happiness are related to a slew of things like reduced stress and anxiety. Folks with higher levels of happiness report better physical and emotional health. We even see things like longer lifespan. One of the things that I personally have looked into is how we rate our relationships. We feel like we've got more successful relationships, and that correlates with our happiness levels. Happier folks tend to be more productive. They're more energetic. We also see happy folks having greater creativity, self-confidence, self-esteem. And we also know that greater happiness leads to things like greater resilience, greater concentration, makes us more cooperative with others. Happiness really is this virtuous cycle. Happier people tend to be healthier overall, and that leads to us being able to do more activities that we enjoy. And with more success, we get more resources to cover those needs, more freedom then to pursue more happiness. It's just this cycle over and over again that happiness keeps feeding into. We see that with our relationships too. The stronger our relationships, we kind of get this mutual reinforcement of joy, more happiness, stronger relationships, and back and forth over and over again.
Happiness leads to more happiness. And one thing we want to constantly emphasize is that happiness is subjective. You have control over it. Now, happiness is influenced by culture and your social situation, but also it's influenced by your perceptions. So every experience we have passes through our five senses, and our brain interprets anything that happens to us based on our unique biochemistry and our personal history. So for example, everyone agrees that the sky is blue. That's objective reality. But how we perceive and assign meaning to that blue sky is individual. And we can also, on the opposite, we can look at a cloudy, rainy day. And you could put that could put you into a bad mood if you perceive it that way, if you interpret that information as bad, or you can say, this is great. You can say, I live in Los Angeles. Laura lives in Orange County. We have droughts. I love rain. Rain's great, right? If I lived in another part of the world where it rained all the time, maybe my subjective reality would be a little bit different. But the objective reality that it's raining, right? We have to assign a meaning to that. So for me in Southern California with droughts, I say that's good. If you live in Seattle, maybe it's not.
Yeah, and I think folks would be really surprised to learn that, we've been doing some research on where happiness comes from. And I think I was surprised to see that researchers have attributed about 50% of our variability in happiness comes from our genetics. And I think that is something that most of our listeners would be surprised to learn as well. that all of these different aspects of happiness can be and are often inherited. And that includes all of these different elements that play into this. Optimism is a heritable trait. So a lot of things like that all play into our perception of happiness. So that is something that we might not have much control over, but that still leaves the balance of the other 50%. And what's fascinating is the things that we might think attribute a great proportion to the variability in our happiness experience, our life circumstances. Those are things like our income, how old we are, how educated we are, our marital status, where we live. All of those pieces really only account for about 8, 10, 15% at most of the heritability, of the experience differences in our happiness reporting. That leaves approximately 40% of the variability in our happiness among humans to be up to us, intentional activities, habits, things that we have control over, that we can choose, that we can change. And I think that's the piece that we really want to focus on, is that portion, which is almost half of the variability in our happiness, that is up to us as individuals.
You'll find in life some people just seem to naturally be happy, and some people naturally tend to not be or be pessimistic. But again, that's only half. That's only half the story is what you're inheriting from birth. And I love this idea that we have tremendous amount of control on. About 40% of it is what we do. So let's talk a little bit about happiness frameworks, Laura. There's different ways to look at happiness, and researchers over the years have come up with different ideas. So can you tell us a little bit about one particular study that came up with 4 different sources of true happiness?
Yeah. The doctor of happiness, right? Ed Diener is a researcher who coined the term subjective well-being, and is really kind of the father of modern happiness studies in psychology. And Diener and a colleague, Kesseber, in 2008, created a framework of 4 sources of true happiness. And these elements include things like wealth. And this is the idea that you don't have to be rich per se, but you do need a base level to meet your basic needs. So you have to be able to have things like housing, food, healthcare, the basics provided for. And that is kind of the baseline. Beyond basics, though, having more money does not guarantee more happiness. And that was kind of a very early finding that keeps being perpetuated. So everyone, in order to be happy, you need to have enough, but getting more doesn't make you happier. Billionaires are not happier than millionaires, but both of them may be happier than folks who are unable to meet their basic needs. Friends, social relationships. Again, that's where my personal studies come in. This is absolutely critical. Human beings are wired for social connection. And we do know that quantity of friendships can be linked to happiness, but not in a more is always better. Having the few that you need gets you to a certain level. After that, though, it's the quality of those relationships. And folks can be happy with just a couple of high quality relationships. So it's not always about quantity, but that quality is a true strength and happiness predictor. And we absolutely know on the flip side, folks who are lonely and socially isolated can definitely be experiencing more of what we might think of the opposite of happiness, things like depression. So we do see that. Do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about the other 2 predictions?
Sure. The other 2 are religion. So having strong beliefs and being actively participating in a community, a religious community, that can often lead to greater happiness. Now that impact varies with different cultures, but that is another component of these 4 sources of true happiness. And then the last one that they come up with is personality. So this is back to that 50% that you're born with. If you have stable traits, like if you're an extrovert or you tend to be optimistic, that tends to boost your happiness. But remember, this genetic influence on your happiness is only about half of the equation. The other half is your subjective reality that you have control over. So those 4 things are wealth, friends and social relationships, religion, and personality. So that's one framework. Another framework is by a guy named Martin Seligman, and he is one of the founders of what's called positive psychology, which, unlike, psychology used to be focused on what's wrong with the human mind and how can we fix things, and we look at Sigmund Freud as one of the founders of early psychology. But positive psychology focuses on human flourishing, human strengths, and well-being. So Seligman came up with 3 different things, 3 different pathways to happiness. Laura, can you go through those for us?
Sure. These are fairly straightforward. 3 different pathways to happiness. One could be having a pleasant life, right? This is thinking in terms of past, present, and future, pleasant and positive emotions. So that feeling of contentment, pleasant, right? Another is having an engaged life. And this is when we think about being deeply involved in things. Do we reach that state of flow in things like our work life, in our leisure activities, and in our social relationships? That's an engaged life. And then the third pathway is a meaningful life. Are we finding and pursuing goals that we can connect to a larger purpose? So having that meaningful life. So 3 different pathways there. When Seligman researched the different types of pathways and the folks that were experiencing or kind of choosing each one of those paths, what he found was that those who followed the pleasure pathway, that had very little contribution to life satisfaction. So not much relationship there between following a pleasure path and life satisfaction. Those who followed the engagement pathway, an engaged life, showed a stronger contribution. But those going after the meaningful life, that's where the strongest contribution was found. So that pursuit of goals that connected to a larger purpose, that seems to be the pathway with the highest contribution to happiness.
This kind of goes back to our previous podcast where we were talking about hedonic, pleasurable things being important but not meaningful, and having eudaimonic pursuits as giving meaning to your life and making life more happy.
Exactly. And Seligman went on to create what he refers to as the PERMA model, PERMA, where each one of those letters, it's an acronym for the 5 levels within this model. So the P stands for positive emotions. And this is the idea of feeling good, right? That's a base piece we need to have happiness. We got to feel good. So we want those positive emotions. The E is for engagement. We want to be able to find flow. R, relationships. And this is the idea of having authentic social connections. And that also seems to be a key to the recipe for happiness. The M keeps coming back to this, right? Meaning. Do we have purposeful existence? Have we found meaning? And the A is achievement. This is our sense of accomplishment. And Seligman would say that these 5 pieces together, the PERMA, right, in this PERMA model, all come together to kind of create this recipe for happiness.
Right. So when we talk about the happiness equation, we talked about what is something you're born with versus what you have control over. And so the equation tells us that happiness is a learnable skill. So if we look at our daily habits and the choices that we make to make ourselves more happy, that can compound the benefits of positive emotions and make us happier people. And it's good to remember that every small action is a chance to move forward so you can have a greater, more fulfilled life. So we're going to put out a challenge to everybody listening to this podcast, which is to choose one specific actionable step to boost your happiness over the next 30 days. So what I want you to think about is come up with an idea, come up with a specific action, that figure out what that purpose and the meaning of that action is. When Where and how long are you going to do this one thing? Who's going to be involved? Is it just going to be you, or are you going to do it with friends or family members? Are you going to have someone who's going to help support you? How often are you going to do this? Who's your accountability partner? It's always good to have a goal or have a plan, but have someone you're going to answer to. So it kind of keeps you honest with yourself, but also you're accountable to someone else to make sure that you do that one thing. Yeah. And then think about how much it might cost you. Like, is this something that costs you money or isn't? So let's think about some examples, Laura.
Yeah, I think something that I could say I'd like to do, maybe I want to reestablish a relationship with an old friend who moved away and I miss them. So maybe I decide I'm going to try to set up a phone date where we speak every Sunday. Maybe I'm looking for a different way to contribute to my community. So I decide that my kids and I are going to volunteer weekly at our local food bank. And I'm going to bring them in to this with me for that accountability piece that we do recognize is very important. Maybe I want to learn a new skill. Maybe I decide I'm going to take a photography class and I'm going to not just take the class, but go out and practice that skill to help it set in. Something else I know we talk about in the book is gratitude, mindfulness. Maybe I'm going to keep a daily journal about what I'm grateful for to be able to help reflect on those kinds of things. But I think those are all examples of specific actionable steps that none of them in and of themselves are huge, but each one gives a way to contribute to my personal happiness.
Right. Great ideas. So let's just sum it all up. Let's just talk about what we talked about. Happiness is not luck. It's a skill that you can build. It's something you need to work on, and you can be purposeful about your happiness. When you're planning your retirement and your life, you should keep happiness as the foundation for what you do and why you do it, because that's going to lead to a happier life. And as we mentioned in the previous podcast, you now have the time to really focus on what makes you happy. So if you want a framework for your ideal retirement and you want worksheets to create that rewarding retirement plan for yourself, check out our book, The Rewarding Retirement Workbook. It's available on Amazon. You can share this episode with anyone in your life who wants to be happier. And Laura, where can they find more about our book and what we talk about?
You can visit our website, rewardingretirementworkbook.com, to learn more.
Thank you very much for joining us on this podcast today. For Laura and myself, Aaron, thank you so much for listening, and go out and find your happiness.
Aaron Kirsch is a wealth advisor at Greenup Street Wealth Management, LLC, DBA Greenup Wealth Management, an investment advisor registered under the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. Registration as an investment advisor does not imply any level of skill or training. The oral and written communications of an advisor provide you with information about which you determine to hire or retain an advisor. For more information, please visit advisorinfo.sec.gov and search for our firm name. This representation has been provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as legal or investment advice or a recommendation of any particular security or strategy. The investment strategy and themes discussed herein may be unsuitable for investors depending on their specific investment objectives and financial situation. Information obtained from third-party sources is believed to be reliable, though its accuracy is not guaranteed. Opinions expressed in this commentary reflect subjective judgments of the author based on conditions at the time of publication and are subject to change without notice. Past performance is not indicative of future results.